The Titanic, the 100-Year Curse. On a freezing night, April 14, 1912, in the Atlantic Ocean, an SOS signal was sent out. That signal announced that the ship, a historic marvel of humanity at the time, was in distress following an incident. The Titanic had only a few hours left before being swallowed by the ocean. What happened next is something we all know to some extent. More than 100 years have passed, and the details of the disaster have been mentioned countless times across mass media. Every second, every minute of the tragedy has been recounted through numerous films and research papers. It seems that no information related to the accident remains a secret, but that is not the case. There are still things we don't know, mysteries that have sunk deep into the ocean floor along with the century-old ship. And today, we will be the ones to uncover those secrets, the final mystery of the Titanic. There is no doubt that, in the early 20th century, the Titanic was the symbol of ultimate luxury created by humankind. The colossal ship was equipped with every top-tier convenience a wealthy person could desire. But perhaps because it was so extravagant, Mother Nature also wanted to partake in enjoying this pinnacle achievement of humanity. The unsinkable ship ultimately lay at the bottom of the ocean. So what happened to the Titanic? Countless hypotheses have been proposed to explain the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, but somehow, they all seem to suggest that the ship's fate was already sealed. On April 10, 1912, the world's largest ship, the steam-powered RMS Titanic, embarked on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. As the ship left the dock, another vessel moored at the port suddenly broke free and headed straight toward the Titanic. The entire dock fell silent as the two ships were mere centimeters apart, but by some miracle they avoided a collision. Many called this incident an ominous sign, a warning of a greater disaster to come. On the second day of the voyage, the Titanic stopped at Queenstown, Ireland. Here, hundreds of tons of food and drinking water were loaded, along with an Egyptian mummy brought on board. It was the mummy of a high priestess from the time of the fourth pharaoh, owned by a British collector, destined for sale to a wealthy businessman in New York. The Titanic took on its final passengers in Ireland before departing the port. At this point, the ship carried 885 crew members and 1,316 passengers, a total of 2,201 souls. It was said that buying a ticket for a ship like the Titanic was akin to buying a ticket to paradise. The Titanic embodied all the achievements in design, engineering, and human ingenuity of the 20th century. It was the most expensive ship ever built in history, $7.5 million at the time, a staggering sum in the early 20th century. The enormous ship, with a height from keel to smokestack equivalent to a 14-story building, was constructed by a team of over 3,000 of the most skilled workers and engineers. The shipbuilding company Harland and Wolff took more than 3 years to complete it. The Titanic had 8 large vertical steel compartments, 4 massive smokestacks, and a one-of-a-kind safety system. White Star Line, the company that owned the ship, even boasted that not even God could sink their prized asset. If you are seeking ultimate luxury, join me in this place, a wine banquet in the first-class cabin of the Titanic. Here, you can see gentlemen with slicked-back hair, impeccably pressed clothes, and an aristocratic demeanor unmatched anywhere else. It feels as though every detail in this space is a masterpiece of art, meticulously crafted. The grand staircase is perhaps the clearest testament to the prestige of a genuine first-class cabin. Music, elegant ladies, and sheer opulence. I don't think there is anything more lavish than this in the middle of the ocean. And this is the result of the unsinkable ship, as people claimed. After 100 years at the bottom of the ocean, I know some might imagine a scene in stark contrast to that luxury in the third-class cabins, but that is not true. Even in third class, you wouldn't see any filth or squalor on the Titanic. A party in the third-class cabin carried the spirit of a true festival. Lively music, dark beer, and spirited dancing as its hallmarks. I believe many would even prefer the atmosphere here over the first-class cabins. However, at 3,800 meters below the sea, the Titanic has lost the elegance and grandeur it once possessed. Countless traces of time's erosion cling to the ship's hull, creating a scene of ruin. It's hard to feel anything in this place, and the scarce images of the ship's wreckage, while not containing much information, still allow us to deduce a few things. One of the hypotheses is that the Titanic was struck by a German submarine during World War I. That is entirely possible in certain scenarios. However, after expeditions to explore the Titanic's wreck, scientists confirmed that the Germans had no involvement in this incident. In fact, the Titanic broke apart completely after colliding with an iceberg. The sudden fragmentation caused the ship to lose its structural integrity as it sank to the bottom. At 12:15 a.m. on April 15, a Canadian wireless station picked up a distress signal from the Titanic. Hours later, this news reached the entire Red Maple Leaf Nation. However, thousands of kilometers away in Russia, something strange occurred. The St. Petersburg News Agency's edition on April 16, 1912, a day after the Titanic had sunk, featured on its front page information about a meeting of the Russian National Duma, followed by weather updates, fire warnings, and various other matters. It wasn't until page 4 that there was a small notice stating, "All passengers of the Titanic have been rescued by the Virginian. The world's largest ship is slowly heading back to port. Thus, nothing has happened. Everything is still fine and under control. The Titanic has not sunk, and all passengers are still alive." But why was this the case? Where did this information come from? It seems that not only St. Petersburg published this misinformation, many places around the world also failed to grasp the full horror of the disaster. In those years, wireless signals couldn't simultaneously reach 200 regions or countries. The most accurate news could only come from Canada, the country closest to the accident site. A day after the false information was released, the St. Petersburg newspaper issued a correction. The Virginian arrived at the disaster site too late. The Titanic, alas, had sunk, and the fate of the passengers on board remained unclear. Typically, immediately after an accident, embassies of various countries would begin searching for information about their citizens. Some crucial information would be sourced from the press. So why was there such carelessness and lack of control over the information? In the early 20th century, the U.S. economy was booming. Migration to the U.S. in search of a better life was happening globally. Americans needed cheaper, more abundant labor to fuel economic growth. And of course, our laborers couldn't travel in the Titanic's first-class cabins. The ticket price for a spot here was $3,100, equivalent to about $200,000 today, a sum that poor workers back then would have to toil their entire lives to afford. The luxury and wealth of the first-class cabins were reserved for aristocrats. Meanwhile, in third class, the cost to secure a spot was $32 at the time. But what did any of that matter when everyone only had one life? On Sunday night, April 14, the temperature dropped to near freezing. The sea was completely calm, the sky was clear, and there was no moon. The Titanic continued its journey. Captain Edward Smith, perhaps cautious after receiving iceberg warnings via signals in the preceding days, altered the Titanic's course 18 kilometers south of the usual sea route. That caution was indeed commendable, but it was still far too little. Earlier, at 1:45 p.m., a message from the steamship SS America warned of large icebergs south of the Titanic's path, but the warning was passed to the hydrographic office and not relayed to the bridge. Later, at 9:30 p.m., another report of numerous large icebergs in the Titanic's path was received by 2 radio room operators, this time from another ship, but this warning, too, was not passed on to the captain. The staff on duty in the communication and hydrographic rooms simply thought these warnings were unnecessary to relay to the captain, as they weren't deemed serious enough to warrant slowing down or altering the ship's course. The Titanic had 3 lookout teams on the observation deck, rotating every 2 hours under all conditions. In the darkness of night, it was almost certain they would spot an iceberg in time, but they forgot that the weather was not as predictable as they thought. No moon, no wind, no binoculars, and the dark side of the iceberg facing the ship. These factors rendered the lookouts useless. Nothing more, nothing less. Everything seemed to conspire against the ship on that deadly night. At 11:30 p.m., while in the Newfoundland area, an easternmost province of Canada, the lookouts noticed something unusual. An iceberg, and the ship was heading straight toward it. They quickly rang the bell 3 times and called the bridge. 6th Officer James Moody answered. "What do you see?" The lookout replied, "Iceberg dead ahead." The brief conversation ended, and Moody promptly informed the officer on deck, but it seemed redundant. The iceberg was already too close. Moody had also noticed it, and was ordering the ship to turn hard to starboard. That small effort proved futile. At 11:40 p.m., those on board braced for impact, as the ship drew ever closer to the iceberg. It was too late. The ship struck a fatal blow, precisely 27 seconds after the lookout reported the iceberg. The starboard side of the ship crashed into the iceberg, causing damage in multiple areas and dislodging rivets below the waterline. Seawater poured in through the breaches. Of course, the Titanic had an excellent water pumping system, and everything would have been fine if only 4 of its compartments had flooded. But the impact was too severe. Watertight doors were closed as water began flooding 5 compartments, one more than the Titanic could withstand while remaining afloat. Captain Smith was informed of the collision and ordered all engines to stop as he reached the bridge to assess the situation. Senior crew members and the captain knew the Titanic would surely sink, and they faced the reality of not having enough life jackets and lifeboats for everyone. At 12:05 a.m., 25 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith ordered the preparation of all lifeboats, which could only accommodate half of the passengers on board. Chaos gradually spiraled out of control. The Titanic's radio operators continued to call for help, even though other ships were relatively close, but the operators on some of those ships were asleep. The Olympic, a sister ship of the White Star Line, heard the distress call, but was too far away to assist. Alas, the Titanic carried 20 lifeboats with a capacity of 1,178 people out of a total of 2,201, including passengers and crew. It was said that the Titanic was too arrogant for not carrying enough lifeboats, but in reality, it carried more lifeboats than required by the British Board of Trade at the time. The number of required lifeboats was determined by the ship's total tonnage, not the number of people. Lifeboat capacity regulations were last updated in 1894, when the largest ship had a gross tonnage of only 10,000 tons, compared to the Titanic's 46,328 tons. In the moments of life and death, everyone rushed to the deck in hopes of survival. Passengers in first and second class easily accessed the lifeboats via the 2 main staircases leading directly to the deck, but third-class passengers were not so fortunate. While the vast majority of women and children in first and second class survived the sinking, most women and children in third class perished. The 2 radio operators tirelessly sent out distress signals. Finally, some ships responded. The nearest ship needed nearly 4 hours to reach the Titanic, a time frame far too long. Land-based receiving stations also picked up the Titanic's distress signals, one being the telegraph station at Cape Race, Newfoundland, atop the Wanamaker Building in New York City. As soon as the distress signals were sent, information was continuously relayed from ship to ship. People immediately flocked to White Star Line offices in New York to follow the fate of the ship. At 2:00 a.m., the Titanic was gradually sinking, but it seemed passengers were not eager to board the lifeboats. The Titanic was warm, brightly lit, and appeared very safe, and there were no outward signs of imminent danger. Climbing into the small, dark, and freezing lifeboats was unappealing. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be lowered with only half their capacity, hoping they would return to rescue those still floating on the water. Some lifeboats were given such instructions. As the ship tilted noticeably, people began to panic, and some lifeboats were lowered with more people on board. Women and children first, that was the command. The ship's propellers began to rise above the water, and seawater heavily seeped through the hatches on the bridge, flooding the forward deck. At that point, Captain Smith allowed the 2 radio operators to abandon their duties to seek survival. At 2:18 a.m., the flooding water shattered the glass dome. The electrical system failed, and the lights, which had been shining brightly, flickered once before going out completely. In an instant, all the boilers were fully submerged. The Titanic's second smokestack, under the strain on the ship, broke off and fell into the water, striking dozens of people in the sea. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic sank entirely. There is an undeniable truth that the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg, but over the years, researchers have strived to uncover the real cause. Immediately after the disaster, investigations by both Britain and the U.S. concluded that the ship was traveling too fast. Had it moved at a slower speed, the accident would not have been as severe, and the Titanic could have completely avoided the icebergs. In that case, the collision would have damaged only 4 compartments, and the ship could have stayed afloat. Many opinions suggest the ship could have avoided the collision if the helmsman at the time had not panicked and steered incorrectly. It's possible the truth was concealed from investigators to protect the reputation of the White Star Line and its associates. After the Titanic sank, amid overwhelming grief, people began passing around stories of strange occurrences surrounding this disaster. At this point, numerous hypotheses have emerged about the ship's disappearance, including mysterious, inexplicable theories. In 1898, the novel Futility, by author Morgan Robertson, told the story of a ship's demise. The author named the ship Titan. The story's setting took place 14 years before the Titanic disaster. In April 1912, after the tragic sinking of the Titanic, people discovered that the Titanic tragedy and the novel's plot had many eerily similar points. It was a clear, freezing night in April. The largest ship ever to sail the seas, with a length of 243 meters and a displacement of 45,000 tons, deemed unsinkable, was gliding across the ocean with about 2,500 passengers sleeping soundly. Then suddenly, the ship struck an iceberg on its starboard side while traveling at 46 kilometers/. The ship sank quickly, and due to an insufficient number of lifeboats, most passengers went down with the ship. It sounds familiar to anyone, even those who know only a little about the Titanic. However, this is not a description of what happened to the Titanic. Indeed, it is the content of the novel we are referring to. The similarities between the Titan and the Titanic are not just in the name and an iceberg, but in many other specifics. The lengths of the 2 ships are nearly identical. The Titan was 243 meters long, while the Titanic was 286 meters. The speed at which the Titan struck the iceberg was 46 kilometers/, while the Titanic's speed was 41 kilometers/. The Titan carried 2,500 passengers. The Titanic carried 2,201, though both had a capacity of 3,000 people. Both ships were British-owned. Both struck an iceberg on the starboard side around midnight. Both sank in the North Atlantic, exactly 740 kilometers from Newfoundland. Although there are a few differences, they are minor. For example, the Titan left only 13 survivors, while the Titanic left 705. The Titan capsized before sinking, while the Titanic broke in 2. After the Titanic tragedy, author Robertson was even labeled a seer, as his work bore an uncanny resemblance to real-life events. After all, the likelihood of someone writing a book resembling a tragedy that had not yet occurred is almost impossible. Out of the 106 million square meters of the Atlantic Ocean that author Robertson could have chosen as the location for the Titan's sinking in his novel, he chose the exact spot where the Titanic sank. There are countless reasons a ship might sink, but the reason in the story was an iceberg. Is there some hidden truth here? It doesn't stop there. The Titanic is said to be tied to far more spiritual and mystical matters than we know. Do you remember the bad omen of the ship nearly being rammed before leaving the port? In fact, many people felt something was off about this ship. Hours before the ship departed, around 55 people canceled their trip for various reasons. 16 of the survivors later said that, on the night of the tragedy, they had dreamed of the ship sinking. To this day, the cause of the Titanic's sinking remains a focal point of debate in the scientific community, with the most famous and mystical explanation being the curse of the mummy. Yes, it is the mysterious mummy we mentioned at the beginning of the video. Around the year 1900, archaeologists excavated a stone sarcophagus from an ancient Egyptian tomb. On the sarcophagus, an inscription read, "Anyone who touches this sarcophagus will meet with disaster and be swallowed by the sea." At the time, no one took the curse seriously, thinking it was merely meant to scare off grave robbers. So they opened the coffin and found an ancient mummy inside. After examination, the mummy was determined to be thousands of years old. Subsequently, the sarcophagus and the mummy were transported to the United Kingdom. Very quickly, it was purchased by a wealthy businessman with a passion for ancient Egyptian culture. Not long after, 3 members of this businessman's family were seriously injured in a bizarre car accident, and the businessman's mansion inexplicably caught fire, as if it had been prearranged. After these events, the businessman, terrified, donated the mummy to a British museum. However, those involved in the earlier excavation continued to die mysteriously. For safety reasons, the British Museum stored the sarcophagus elsewhere and ceased using it for display. Later, the museum sold the mummy to a collector, who immediately enlisted one of Europe's most renowned witches to perform an exorcism on the mummy. However, it was ineffective. According to the witch, the mummy harbored immense demonic energy that could not be dispelled, and she earnestly advised getting rid of it as soon as possible. At that time, no museum dared to accept the mummy. Over the course of 10 years, 20 people lost their lives because of it. News of the mummy somehow crossed the ocean and reached a wealthy American businessman who purchased it. Coincidentally, it was the Titanic that was responsible for transporting this cargo. To this day, the name Titanic remains ever relevant whenever it is mentioned. On the afternoon of June 18 this year, the exploration submersible Titan, operated by Ocean Gate, embarked on an expedition to the wreck of the Titanic, and tragically, that journey claimed the lives of all members of the expedition team. The submersible Titan is a product of Ocean Gate, an adventure tourism company based in the United States. Since May 2023, the company had announced an 8-day Titanic exploration tour priced at $250,000 per person. According to Ocean Gate, 250 people have witnessed the Titanic wreck firsthand to date. Thus, those who join the tour are not merely tourists, but also carry the mission of exploration. On June 18, 2023, during an underwater exploration of the Titanic, the submersible lost contact after less than 2 hours. On board were 5 people, including British billionaire Hamish Harding, Ocean Gate founder Stockton Rush, Pakistani businessman Shahzada Dawood, and his son. The descent of the Titan submersible began at 4:00 a.m. local time. Subsequently, the submersible lost contact with its mothership, Polar Prince, and was determined to be approximately 1,450 kilometers off the coast of Cape Cod. The U.S. Coast Guard only received a missing report later, and this delay posed significant challenges to the search process. The U.S. Coast Guard then deployed 2 aircraft for a surface search, while high-tech submersibles and aircraft equipped with underwater sonar systems were mobilized to search the ocean depths. But the results were not promising. The Titan is a research submersible capable of carrying about 5 people. Made of titanium and carbon fiber, it is 6.7 meters long, weighs 10,432 kilograms, equivalent to an average car, and can dive to depths of nearly 4,000 meters. The submersible is equipped with a camera, lighting, and scanners to explore its surroundings. The front hatch serves as an entry point. Despite being constructed with modern materials, David Lockridge, former director of marine operations at OceanGate, had warned about the thickness of the Titan's hull and the potential dangers to passengers when the submersible reached extreme depths. He stated that the design was still experimental, and the submersible could realistically only withstand depths of about 1,300 meters. Diving deeper could pose risks. Lockridge later stated in court documents that he was terminated shortly after raising these concerns. Over 30 experts subsequently sent a letter to OceanGate's CEO, stating that the testing methods employed by the company could lead to catastrophic outcomes. Overall, OceanGate had faced years of criticism from experts regarding the safety of its submersible. However, all warnings were ignored. But perhaps we don't realize that the Titan was not the first vessel to encounter trouble during an exploration mission. Expeditions to the Titanic wreck in 1991, 1995, and 2000 all experienced incidents that could have cost the lives of those on board. These revelations came just days after the U.S. Coast Guard announced that all individuals on the tourist submersible Titan had perished in a catastrophic explosion. It seems the victims' bodies will never be recovered, meaning they will remain forever in the mass grave of the Titanic they were en route to visit. The site where the legendary Titanic rests, approximately 550 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, lies at a depth of 3,800 meters below the Atlantic surface. According to CBC, only 10 submersibles worldwide are believed capable of reaching such depths. Even vessels that underwent rigorous testing prior to these missions encountered troublesome incidents while diving to the Titanic wreck site. The Canadian, Russian, and American expedition team in 1991 also experienced a heart-stopping incident when the Russian Mir submersible became entangled in the wreckage of the Titanic itself. The team called for another Mir submersible on the expedition to assist, guiding the captain on how to maneuver out of the trap. Deep-sea exploration expert, Canadian Dr. Joe McInnes, said that timely assistance at the scene that year saved their lives. Another incident occurred 4 years later when Hollywood director James Cameron was caught in a sandstorm sweeping across the ocean floor in 1995. The director was in the process of filming the wreck for the blockbuster movie Titanic, released in 1997. As his submersible battled the currents, its battery began to deplete, and the submersible attempted to surface immediately, but it felt as though it had hit a 20-meter-high wall, only to be pushed back down to the ocean floor. The same happened when they tried again. A downward current forced their fragile submersible back down. They were forced to wait in darkness and near freezing temperatures for the battery to recover. On their third attempt, they managed to surface after a 5-hour ordeal. A third near-fatal incident occurred in 2000 when science journalist Michael Gillen had the opportunity to visit the Titanic. A current swept the submersible up and crashed it into one of the Titanic's propellers, dislodging rusting debris and trapping the submersible. Gillen recounted, "Our submersible was like a giant plum compared to the propeller. Massive chunks of the Titanic's wreckage began falling onto our submersible. I knew I was in trouble. After an hour of maneuvering back and forth, under the skillful control of Russian captain Viktor Lisitsyn, the submersible managed to extricate itself and surface." The Titan submersible tragedy is facing a lengthy investigation, as well as lawsuits from the victims' families. The Titan explosion, the first fatal tourist submersible accident in the world, will undoubtedly spark debates about safety and possibly calls for stricter regulations on this type of adventure tourism. OceanGate, the only company in the world offering submersible tours to the Titanic wreck, refused to have the Titan submersible certified for safety by third parties, such as the American Bureau of Shipping or Europe's DNV Safety Certification Service. Of the approximately 10 submersibles capable of reaching the depth of the Titanic wreck, around 4,000 meters below the ocean, only the Titan was uncertified. Was this recent accident merely a human error, or is it a true omen of the curses surrounding the legendary Titanic? Whatever the case, perhaps we should let the Titanic rest in peace beneath the ocean. Perhaps its fate was always meant to be this way, and no one should disturb it. Thank you to the audience who stayed until this moment. Goodbye, and see you all in the next videos.